Welcome everyone to the Warburg Institute. I'm John Tresh, I teach here, and I'm extremely happy to see you all here, many of you again, for what is now the third installment of our Stargates series, which is organized by my co-host, Luisa Capodiece, who's a professor at the Sorbonne and is the mind behind this organization. So Luisa, I hand the further introductions over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for agreeing to open our Stargates with me. And thanks to the Warburg, thanks you all for coming. And please help me welcome Nicolas Weill-Parot, who is professor of history of science in the medieval Occident at the École pratique de haute étude in Paris. He first worked on the concept of the astrological image and on the frontiers between science and magic. He published on this subject an important book, Les images astrologiques au Moyen Âge et à la Renaissance, which was awarded by the Académie des Belles-Lettres. He had also published an annotated edition of the Opus Praeclarum de Imaginibus Astrologicis, remarkable work on astrological images, the Hieronymus Torella, who was the physician of the Pope Borgia. Then Nicolas Weill-Parot worked on the internal frontiers of medieval science, in particular physics, and he wrote another book on this subject. Point aveugle de la nature, la rationalité scientifique médiévale face à l'occulte, l'attraction magnétique et l'horreur du vide. Now he's working on the utopian frontiers of science, and he has published last year a book on flying through the air in the Middle Ages, Les vols dans les airs au Moyen Âge, essai sur une utopie scientifique. Today his lecture deals with an exciting topic, scientific utopia versus magic, two ways of endowing artificial figure with celestial powers. And so we are ready to listen to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thank you, John Tresh. Thank you to the Warburg Institute. Thank you to you for inviting me. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, right. Well, I'm sorry, but my English is not very. It's not the English of Shakespeare. I'm really sorry about that. In this lecture, I will show two ways. Well, I'm going to share my screen. Yes. Okay. I will show two ways of understanding or the power of certain artificial images in the 13th century. The first is Albert the Great's views on astrological images. His approach is one of natural magic. The second is Roger Bacon's view on the same kind of image. His approach is part of a general scientific project that could be described as utopian. And Bacon's way of understanding the power of these images can be compared to other examples of extraordinary inventions he mentions, such as the magnetic sphere that moves by itself. We can start by making the distinction between three levels of definitions, namely of talismans, astrological talismans, astrological images. First, the broadest category is that of talismans. We can call talismans all magical artifacts, all magical objects produced by man. Second, inside this broadest category, there's a category of astrological talismans. An astrological talisman can be defined as a talisman whose power can be ascribed to astrological influences of planets, stars, constellations, but also influences of astral spirits. Third, inside the second subcategory, we find the astrological images. The notion, the concept of astrological images was coined by the middle of the 13th century in the anonymous book called Mirror of the Science of the Stars, Speculum Astronomiae. This was a concept, this was an idea born in the brain of a scholar eager to make room for a licit kind of talismanic magic, a natural astral magic. The astrological image was supposed to be an astrological talisman in the making of which there was no ritual, no utterance of magical words, no inscriptions, and no other addressative elements. I call addressative, it's a strange name, but addressative, every practice addressed to a superior addressee, an intelligent addressee, to a spirit, either a demon or an angel. The astrological image is a talisman which derives its power only from the natural influence of a planet, a star, or a constellation. The astrological image exclusively takes its power from these natural astral forces and not from spirits or demons. Thus, the astrological image was intended to be a talisman, scientifically justified and licit according to the religious norm. It was a non-addressative talisman. In the Middle Ages, there was a strong debate among the scholastic authors between supporters of such an idea, for instance, Albert the Great, and opponents to this concept, for instance, Thomas Aquinas. Indeed, in his work on minerals, De Mineralibus, written between 1251 and 1254, the great Dominican scholar Albert the Great argues that man can make artificial magical seals or talismans without any help of demons. So they are a kind of astrological images. The maker just grabs the natural influences of stars and constellation and the right time. He engraves a gem in a gem, a special figure at a very specific time. This specific time is determined by the astral chart, namely, he chooses the right time when this or that constellation is ruling. Hence, he inserts his own action within a chain of causes originating in the stars and ending with the making of this artificial seal in a gem. For instance, he carves a figure of Cancer upon a gem when the sign Cancer is ruling, and therefore the sign of Cancer endows this gem with the power to relieve warm and dry fevers. Here in the slide, you see the famous seal of Leo. This theory allows Albert the Great to build a naturalistic model able to explain how such talismans work. Albert the Great scrupulously respects the philosophical and theological framework of his time. According to this framework, human ars, that is human artificial production, I will say now art, but it's not art. It's not art in the meaning of every production, every artificial production. Human art cannot equal nature, let alone surpass nature. Man's work cannot reach the power of nature. According to the explanation given by Albert the Great, you can see that the efficient cause is the astral influences, that is to say, nature. The maker who carves the gem with an artificial figure is no more than the instrumental cause. As a last resort, nature is the actual cause of the power of the engraved image. Thus, the hierarchy between natura and art, nature and art, is well respected. The craftsman who makes the astrological seal doesn't exceed nature. He becomes the arm of nature. Albert the Great is undoubtedly the author who managed to push the furthest the possibilities of the scholastic framework, which maintain this inferiority of art compared to nature. Note that Albert the Great assumes that this art is making, the art of making astrological seals belongs to nigromancy, namely this part of nigromancy which is dependent on astrology. I put here the manuscript because in the Borgnet edition, the term is necromantia, but in the manuscript it's nigromantia. That is, in general, magic, generally demonic magic, but here, as we see, it's not demonic magic, it's a part of magic. It's like a synonym here of magic. This is to say, he asserts clearly that the art of astrological seals falls under magic, precisely astral magic, and more precisely, natural astral magic. What is properly the natural force at stake? It is obviously the same kind of power as the natural and wonderful power of certain stones, especially gems. In the same treatise De Mineralibus, Albert argues that certain gems have a wonderful power which comes from their species or substantial forms. For there are two different kinds of power. The first kind of power comes from the mixing of elements of the natural body. This is mixing of hot, cold, dry, wet qualities. The second kind of power stems from the substantial or specific form of the body. For instance, beryl, the gem, has a wonderful power against liver pain. This power cannot be reduced to the mixing of the primary qualities, hot, cold, dry, wet, of the beryl, but it stems from the substantial or specific form of the beryl. This doctrine comes from the physicians, and precisely from Galen, but more directly from Avicenna's canon of medicine. This kind of power deriving from the substantial or specific form will be later called occult property. In his treatise De Mineralibus, Albert assumes that this kind of power can be provided not only to certain species of gems, but also to some individual stones, individual gems, to which the stars have given some special figures. That is the reason why, when the craftsman himself makes an artificial seals by carving a figure, he prepares the material, the stone, in such a way that the stars endow the stone with a new occult property. This property doesn't come from the substantial or specific form of the stone, but from an individual and accidental form given by the stars. Therefore, there are two different kinds of occult properties. First, a specific or substantial occult property, a property that all the gems of a special species have. This property comes from the specific form of all these kind of gem, and an individual or accidental occult property coming from an accidental individual form. Substantial or specific occult properties have nothing to do with magic. They are purely natural. In the world, there are some natural bodies endowed with occult powers because they belong to a species of beings with these inherent properties. These gems have the power to cure the headache, for instance, as human beings have their property to think. It's the same kind, it's specific. On the other hand, as we have seen, individual or accidental occult properties which rise after an artificial making of a thing, for instance, an astrological seal, these properties, individual, accidental, are magical, natural and magical. Why? A very generic definition of magic can be given. Magic applies to every wonderful artificial operation whose cause is hidden. In nigromantical operation, the hidden cause is a demon. In nigromantical, that is in the meaning here of demonic magic, of course. But in natural astral magic, the hidden cause is occult property, precisely an accidental, individual occult property. Occult property makes possible the concept of natural magic. Natural because, on the one hand, the cause is natural, and magic because, on the other hand, the cause, occult property, remains definitely hidden. Let us summarize. Albert the Great argues that man can make artificial seals endowed with astral and natural powers. He sees such operations as part of natural astral magic. Now, let us see a contemporary of Albert the Great, the famous English Franciscan Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon faces the same kind of astrological seals or astrological image, but his approach is completely different. In the Opus Tertium, one of his last works, Roger Bacon addresses such operation as images, characters, that is signs, charms, prayers, curses. Common people, he says, think that these practices are magical, but learned men or scientists know that for the main part, they are philosophical, which means that they can be understood according to a scientific framework. Later in his treatise, Bacon argued that astrology is the science which makes the distinction between, on the one hand, certain images, charms, and characters called philosophical, since they are based on the truth of philosophy. And on the other hand, another kind of images, charms, and characters which are made according to the fraud and error of the magical art. In order to understand such a distinction, Bacon refers to what he wrote previously concerning the power of words. Indeed, in a previous chapter, he wrote that the scientist, well, it's not a real scientist, sapiens, it's very hard to translate, but the idea, learned man, scientist. The scientist can operate scientifically, and the magician, magicus, magically. The difference between the scientist and the magician lies on the fact that the scientist produces the effect by a natural power, whereas the magician doesn't produce anything, or if he does, the real producer of the operation is the devil. Bacon's approach of magic is very different from Albert's one. Albert draws a clear line separating licit practices and illicit practices according to the criterion of addressativity. Thus, he rejects such practices as charms or characters because since they are words, they necessarily imply a relationship with an addressee, with an intelligence able to understand them. And this intelligence is a demon. As for Bacon, the criterion of addressativity is not the most relevant. In his views, even charms and characters can actually have a natural power deriving from the soul of the performer or from the stars. But, and this is very important, Albert the Great supports the idea that beside the illicit magic or nigromancy, there is a room for illicit natural magic, whereas Bacon absolutely rejects, in his last works, any kind of magic. In his views, philosophical images, charms, and character are absolutely not magical. They are completely inserted into science. And this is not a play on words. This difference is fundamental. I say because I have read some great misunderstandings about Bacon's position on magic. Bacon's complete rejection of any kind of magic is based on a specific distinction between magic and philosophy. This distinction lies on a key concept, knowability. Well, it's not a very fine word. The thing is to be able to be known. Okay, so I say connaissabilité, knowability. I think you can understand what I mean. The magician ignores the real causality at work in the operation which he performs. Either this operation has no efficacy or its actual efficacy is due, although it doesn't know it, to natural causes or to the action of demons. On the other hand, the scientist who uses philosophically, that is scientifically, the natural causes actually knows very well that these causes are located in his soul and in the celestial bodies. This knowledge of the cause is the criterion for the distinction between magic and philosophy. This is to say, between magic and science. Hence, this principle of knowability underlies the definition of what Bacon sees as the achievement of science, that is, the scientia experimentalis, the experimental science. As it is very well known, according to Bacon, scientia experimentalis has three dignities or prerogatives. First, it certifies by experiment the conclusions of other sciences. Second, it can reach magnificent truths located at the border of other sciences. Third, it aims at disclosing the secrets of nature. In his very famous passage of the Epistola de Secretis Artis et Naturae, which is obviously an authentic work, Bacon explains how the scientia experimentalis enables man to produce artifacts with which overcome nature. He lists, this is very well known, I'm sure every English knows that, he lists several extraordinary machine instruments, such as self-moving cars, self-sailing boats, flying machines, etc., etc. To be sure, Bacon would not be able to provide the details of how to make these instruments. But he assumes that such extraordinary instruments can be made one day, and that when they are manufactured, the complete chain of their causes will be known. In other words, scientia experimentalis is not magic at all. It belongs entirely to science. This is to the realm of things that are known and that can be known. In a certain way, according to Bacon's standpoint, there is no fundamental difference between the so-called philosophical images and another extraordinary thing, namely a thing that he describes, a self-rotating magnetic sphere. In several of his works, Bacon described a sphere which rotates according to the turning motion of the celestial void. He calls this the most extraordinary invention, since it overcomes every astronomical instrument, since it would give the exact astronomical time at every moment. This invention is mentioned in several works, in his Opus Maius and in his Epistola de Secretis Artis et Naturae, as pointed out by Robert Halleux, but also in the Communia Mathematica. In the Communia Mathematica, Bacon, without any discontinuity, alludes to such an instrument just after having listed various ordinary astronomical instruments like the astrolabe, the quadrant, etc. In the Epistola, the description is located in a section devoted to the wonderful powers of magnets, so we can deduce the material of the sphere, its magnetic sphere. Clearly, Bacon borrows this instrument from an experimentator he greatly admired, namely Petrus Peregrinus of Maricourt, Pierre de Maricourt, as pointed out by Halleux. Petrus Peregrinus, or Pierre de Maricourt, is a prominent figure of medieval science. Few things are known about his life. He was probably a native from Picardy, northern France, and was employed as a kind of military engineer in the French army of Charles d'Anjou, fighting in Italy. His letter on the magnet was completed on August the 8th of the year 1269, in front of the city of Lucera, during the warfare siege led to this city of southern Italy. The historians of science always make mention of his name because he's one of the few medieval scientists who actually performed real experiments in the very meaning of the modern science. Indeed, in his letter on the magnet, he describes several experiments made in order to understand the magnetic polarity. But besides these purely experimental tests, he also describes two imaginary inventions, namely a perpetual wheel moved by a magnetic device and a self-rotating sphere made of magnets, made of lodestone. These imaginary inventions are put forward in keeping with the experiments with magnets without any conceptual discontinuity. Let us see now the self-rotating magnetic sphere described by Petrus Peregrinus. First, Petrus rejects the wrong opinion of those who ascribe the magnetic force to the mineral places where there are lodestones or to the North Star. He attributes the origin of this magnetic force to the celestial poles. This explanation, as we know, is the more significant improvement in the understanding of magnetism until 1600, when William Gilbert demonstrated that the origin of the magnetic force is located in the terrestrial poles. But Petrus Peregrinus adds that all the parts of the lodestone receive their power from the other parts of the heavens. Therefore, we should make a magnetic ball and fix it between a pivot up and a pivot down. That is, on the two poles of the round lodestone. The whole weight must be equally distributed. The magnetic sphere must be located in the axis of the meridian, each pivot being the corresponding pole. If you do so, argues Petrus, the lodestone will turn according to the motion of the heavens. So you will be delighted that you have discovered a wonderful secret, he writes. But if this device doesn't work, you must ascribe the failure to your own lack of skill rather than to a defeat in nature, certainly. Petrus Peregrinus ascribes an astronomical aim to this turning magnetic sphere. It will serve as an astronomical clock, which naturally show the exact astrological or astronomical chart. Robert Halleux see like a magnetic armillary sphere, but I think it's more like an astronomical clock in a way. Therefore, you will not need a timepiece anymore. Thus, Petrus assumes that the craftsman has already carved a complete celestial chart on the sphere, showing planets, stars, constellations. This would indeed be an astronomical clock directly connected with the motion of the heavens. By turning according to the motion of the celestial vault, the magnetic celestial globe shows at any time the precise astrological time. Let us compare the philosophical images and the magnetic sphere of Petrus and Bacon according to the approach of Bacon. Both of them are man-made objects. Both of them receive a specific figura. For instance, an astrological seal bears the figure of a constellation, and the magnetic sphere has the round figure of the whole celestial sphere. In other words, both figures represent the source of their power. The constellation for astrological seal, the entire celestial vault in the case of the magnetic sphere. Both of them receive a special power from the heavens. The astrological seal of Aries, for instance, receives the power to cure headaches from the sign of Aries. The magnetic sphere receives the power to turn from all the parts of the heavens. Remember, according to Aristotle, both powers, alteration and rotation, are motions. So just like the heavens themselves rotate, they give the power to rotate to the celestial sphere, to the magnetic sphere, I'm sorry. Therefore, in Bacon's view, the philosophical image and the self-moving magnetic sphere belong to the same category of things. Both of them are provided by the scientia experimentalis, drawing on all the resources of the science of the stars, astronomia. There is nothing magic in them. Their cause is understood as explicit and not as hidden. Just like the other extraordinary devices listed by Bacon, both of them can be called scientific utopias. I put this provocative name, scientific utopia, because despite of the anachronism of the word utopia, a word coined by Thomas More in the 16th century, it seemed to grasp perfectly what is at stake. Of course, it is not a medieval name, but as we know, we cannot do conceptual history if we keep exactly the same lexicon. It's impossible. We have to understand things. In generic terms, I would define a scientific utopia as follows. It's an imaginary projection involving a technological dream. It's astonishing and extraordinary, inducing wonderment or fear. Third, it implies an attempt of rationalization, at least a slight one. As the term suggests, a scientific utopia is part of scientific thought. This is precisely the way followed by Bacon. 4, it comes against a scientific or technological limit, which makes the project unrealistic, maybe for quite a long time. A scientific utopia is possible and yet impossible. Its actual potential for realization is indeterminate. Bacon locates his extraordinary instruments in an uncertain place between fiction, past, present, and future. This possibility remains indeterminate, undefined. 5. The utopian scientist is implicitly or explicitly aware that this idea is impractical at the time when he lives. Bacon assumes of the present possibility of realizing the extraordinary instruments, but this assertion itself reflects this awareness of a distance from the stage of their actual realization. In short, a scientific utopia involves an imaginary and extraordinary project expressed within the rational framework of science. Its status wavers between the possible and the impossible in the thinker's own view. It's an intentional projection beyond what is currently viewed as possible for science. I cannot insist here on the specific scientific utopia in Bacon's eschatological project of reformation of Christianity, a question I have dealt with elsewhere. I will only remind that Bacon makes extrapolations from the science of his time, for instance, from statics, and that he believes that most of these extraordinary inventions were discovered in the ancient times and have been forgotten. In a way, in Bacon's mind, most of scientific utopias are retro-utopias. Thus, Bacon's understanding of the image endowed with celestial power is very different from that of Albert the Great. The reason of their two distinct views lies on their respective worldviews and the scientific frameworks these worldviews imply. Albert the Great thinks that the whole world is explicable here and now by means of the Aristotelian natural philosophy. According to this rationalistic assumption, science can already provide a complete explanation of the whole natural world. Only blind spots of nature, like occult properties, can be fathomed. But since these hidden parts are permanently beyond the reach of the human intellect, they can be definitively encapsulated by the concept of occult property, and hence the unknown is permanently contained. The entire natural world can therefore be explained in rational terms. The natural occult doesn't disturb this perfectly rational and closed system. This was the prevalent scholastic framework, especially in the period 1250, 1320. In contrast, Roger Bacon puts forward this philosophy of secrecy. While the natural occult is permanently beyond the reach of man's rational knowledge, a secret is a phenomenon yet to be explained. It's a phenomenon will be explained in future knowledge. A secret is a truth locked up in a box, and someday human progress will open it. In Bacon's view, science is open and in a way unsettled. The secreta naturae, the secret of nature, form, create the field of scientia experimentalis. Bacon does accept the existence of occult properties, of course, but his approach highlights the way of secrets rather than the way of natural occult. While the concept of occult property allows for the existence of natural magic within a philosophy of natural occult, Bacon's philosophy of secrecy does not. Rather, it enables mankind to disclose the potentiality of natural gradually, to disclose all the potentiality, but in a progressive way. The natural process is potentially explicable by human science and can be mastered by human art within the scientia experimentalis, a synthesis of theoretical thought and action. The power of art, is the second founding principle of Bacon's scientific utopia. Bacon's focus on the power of human art, techne, the activity of production, is very well known. Almost all medieval authors assert that art can only ever be an imperfect imitation of nature. In contrast, this inferiority of art compared to nature is based both on theological and philosophical arguments, as we have seen. In contrast, Bacon is one of the very few medieval thinkers who maintain that art can be more powerful than nature. In the first chapter of the Epistola de Secretis Operibus Artis and Naturae, Bacon writes, although nature is powerful and wonderful, nevertheless art, which uses nature as an instrument, is more powerful than natural power, as shown by many examples. How an artificial image can be endowed with a natural power coming from the heavens? We have seen two different answers. Albert the Great builds up a very comprehensive explanation which assumes a hidden part, the occult property. Thus, his explanation belongs to natural magic, more precisely, natural astral magic. This natural magic sticks to the orthodox framework that sees works of art as imperfect imitation of nature and thus sees art definitely inferior to nature. The astrologer craftsman chooses the astrological time when the special constellation is ruling, and then he makes the relevant astrological seal. His action is inserted in the course of nature. He doesn't pretend to overcome the course of nature. In Albert's rational worldview, science is closed, we have said, everything is known, the unknown is mastered, and this mastering of the unknown is the foundation for natural magic. Natural magic is built upon a definitely hidden cause encapsulated in the rational concept of occult property. In contrast, Roger Bacon's worldview is that of an open and unachieved science. Experimental science is called to unveil the secrets of nature in a progressive and indefinite advance. In such an approach, astrological images are philosophical images, which means that they completely belong to science and not to magic because their cause is seen as knowable, able to be known. Accordingly, the philosophical images can very well be compared, even brought closer to another figura, namely the magnetic sphere, which rotates according to the turning motion of the celestial vault. There is, in Bacon's mind, no structural difference between astrological philosophical images and self-turning magnetic sphere. Both of them belong to scientia experimentalis. We could say that both of them fall under the category of scientific utopias. Thank you.